The conveyor belt hummed with mechanical precision as row after row of leather uppers moved steadily forward, each pair taking shape beneath the hands of workers who barely glanced up as the German prisoners were escorted through. Hans Müller stood transfixed, his eyes following the endless procession of half-formed shoes marching toward completion. Before the war, he had worked in his father's small cobbler shop in Dresden, where a single pair of quality boots might require 2 full days of craftsmanship. Yet here, in this cavernous American factory in Massachusetts, more shoes emerged in an hour than his family business produced in months. The guards nudged the prisoners forward, but Hans lingered, watching as a young woman, no older than his sister, effortlessly operated a stitching machine that joined leather to sole with impossible speed. When finally forced to move along, he turned to Karl, the former tank commander who had survived El Alamein only to surrender in Sicily, and whispered, "How can they make so many? Who could possibly wear them all?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, but echoing in the minds of men who had grown up believing in German superiority, only to find themselves confronted by an industrial might that defied everything they'd been told about America. The prisoners had arrived at Camp Devens just 3 weeks earlier, part of a contingent captured in the Mediterranean theater and transported across the Atlantic. Their journey had been marked by dread, each man carrying memories of Goebbels' warnings about the fate awaiting German soldiers in enemy hands. "The Americans will work you to death," officers had cautioned before battle. "They hate our kind and will show no mercy." These promises of brutality had been repeated so often that few questioned them. When the transport ships docked at Boston Harbor, many prisoners had steeled themselves for immediate punishment, perhaps even execution. Instead, they were processed efficiently, given medical examinations, and provided with clean uniforms before being transported to camps scattered across the American countryside. For Hans, the first shock had been the food. The morning after arrival, prisoners were served eggs, toast with real butter, coffee with actual sugar, and even fruit, rations that exceeded what German civilians had seen in years. Some refused to eat, convinced the food must be poisoned or that accepting American generosity somehow betrayed the fatherland. But hunger eventually overcame ideology, and soon the mess hall buzzed with the quiet murmur of men discovering that captivity in America meant eating better than they had as free soldiers in Hitler's army. Hans had written in the small notebook he kept hidden in his mattress, "First week as prisoner. Expected beatings. Received bacon." The factory visit came as part of a labor program established under the Geneva Convention. Prisoners with relevant skills were assigned to non-military production facilities, working for tokens that could be exchanged for small luxuries like cigarettes or chocolate. When Hans volunteered to work in a shoe factory, citing his experience as a cobbler, he had expected a small workshop, similar to those he knew in Germany. What he encountered instead was a facility spanning several acres, with machinery that transformed raw leather into finished footwear through a process so streamlined it seemed almost magical. "This is just one of 17 such plants in New England alone," the foreman had explained through a translator, his casual pride more devastating than any boast. What troubled Hans most wasn't simply the scale, though that was overwhelming enough, but the purpose. These weren't military boots or specialized equipment. They were ordinary shoes for ordinary people. Women's pumps, children's school shoes, men's work boots, casual loafers. An entire industrial complex devoted to ensuring that civilians, even in wartime, could walk comfortably. How could this be reconciled with Goebbels' assertions that Americans were suffering, that their economy was collapsing under the strain of war? If they could produce such abundance for something as simple as footwear, what might their armament factories look like? The thought sent a chill through Hans that had nothing to do with the October breeze that followed them back to the camp that evening. As weeks passed, the prisoners settled into routines that further eroded their preconceptions about American brutality. Instead of the harsh punishments they'd expected, guards maintained a professional distance, enforcing rules without unnecessary cruelty. The barracks, while Spartan, were heated better than many German homes had been in recent winters. Medical care was prompt and thorough, with even minor ailments receiving attention that would have been considered wasteful in Wehrmacht field hospitals. But perhaps most disorienting was the casual abundance that surrounded them, not as special treatment for prisoners, but as the apparent normal state of American life. How could such wealth exist in a nation supposedly weakened by democracy and diversity? What powers had the Reich truly challenged in declaring war against such a country? As the prisoners filed back from the factory that day, something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of the conflict they had been part of. The enemy was not merely fighting with different weapons. They were fighting from a different world entirely. And the true revelation was still to come, when Hans would discover not just how Americans produced their shoes, but who was meant to wear them. The following morning, Hans sat on his bunk, carefully noting everything he had witnessed in the shoe factory. His pencil moved swiftly across the paper, recording details about the conveyor systems, the specialized machines, the effortless way workers completed tasks that would have required master craftsmen in Germany. Beside him, Werner Hoffmann, a former Luftwaffe navigator, leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father owned a small shoe store in Hamburg," Werner said. "In '38, leather became so scarce that we began making soles from pressed paper and wood pulp. By '41, customers needed ration stamps to buy even those inferior shoes." He gestured toward the window, beyond which lay the sprawling camp and, somewhere in the distance, the factory they had visited. "Yesterday, I counted. They produced more shoes in one afternoon than my father sold in 2 years." Similar conversations rippled through the barracks as the men struggled to reconcile what they had been told about America with what they now witnessed firsthand. Their captors were supposed to be soft, decadent, and disorganized, a mongrel nation without discipline or capacity for sacrifice. Yet everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of organizational skill and industrial might that dwarfed the Reich's accomplishments. Signs of abundance were not limited to the factories they worked in. Even within the confines of the camp, America's productive capacity was evident. The electrical system never faltered, hot water flowed reliably, and the mess hall consistently served meals that would have been considered feasts back home. "Perhaps they show us these things to demoralize us," suggested Friedrich Keller, an SS officer who had maintained his rigid posture and ideological certainty even in captivity. It could be elaborate stagecraft meant to break our spirit, but his words lacked conviction. The scale of what they witnessed daily made such deception implausible. No nation would or could maintain such an elaborate charade merely to impress prisoners. For Hans, the most unsettling moment came during the second week at the factory. While organizing leather cutting patterns, he noticed an order sheet listing production numbers for the month. 300,000 pairs of children's shoes, 500,000 women's styles, 400,000 men's work boots, all from this single facility. When he asked the floor supervisor about the figures, the man responded with casual indifference. "That's actually below quota. We've had some supply chain issues with the rubber components." The supervisor's disappointment over producing only more than 1 million shoes in a month struck Hans as absurd, almost comical. But laughter died in his throat as he calculated what these numbers meant across all 17 New England factories, let alone those in other regions. That evening, the German prisoners huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about what they had seen. Karl, the former tank commander, had been assigned to a different factory, producing field telephones, and his report was equally sobering. "They've automated everything," he explained, sketching the assembly line on a scrap of paper. "Parts move through stations without human handling. Women operate machines that test 60 units simultaneously." He shook his head, the memory still fresh. When I asked how many they make daily, the supervisor seemed confused by the question, as if counting individual units was beneath consideration. "Thousands," he said. "We measure output by the truckload." Others shared similar accounts from textile mills, food processing plants, and equipment manufacturers. Each story reinforced a growing suspicion that Reich, that promised thousand-year dominance, had miscalculated fundamentally in challenging a nation with such overwhelming productive capacity. "In Berlin," Werner said quietly, "they told us America was a paper tiger, unable to convert its wealth to military power. But if they make shoes and telephones with such efficiency, What of tanks and planes? No one answered. They didn't need to. The question followed them to their dreams, where the rhythmic hum of American machinery seemed to drown out the fading echoes of the Führer's speeches. Outside, autumn leaves skittered across the campyard, and the factory chimneys in the distance continued belching smoke into the darkening sky, each plume a testament to an industrial power that operated round the clock, restlessly efficient in ways the prisoners were only beginning to comprehend. Hans returned to the factory the next morning with new eyes, attention focused not just on the manufacturing process, but on the people operating it. The American workforce was nothing like he had expected. Women made up nearly half the employees, moving with confidence between tasks that in Germany would have been considered men's work. Even more surprising was the diversity. He noted Italian surnames on ID badges, heard Spanish spoken during breaks, saw black workers operating the same machines and earning the same wages as their white counterparts. This contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had claimed about American society being weakened by its heterogeneity. "That woman there," Hans whispered to Werner as they sorted leather pieces, "she's been promoted twice since we arrived. The floor manager consults her about production problems." He nodded toward a middle-aged woman directing younger workers with quiet authority. In Germany, she would never hold such responsibility. Werner's response was immediate. Because she's a woman or because she's clearly Jewish? The observation struck Hans like a physical blow. He hadn't made the connection, but Werner was right. The woman's name badge read Rosenbaum. According to everything they had been taught, such a person should be incapable of the technical skill and leadership she displayed. Yet here she was, essential to an industrial machine that was outproducing the Reich by orders of magnitude. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a shipment that caused a stir on the factory floor. Workers gathered around newly delivered crates, expressions brightening as the contents were revealed. Fresh supplies of premium leather, rubber components, and specialized dyes that had supposedly been impossible to obtain due to wartime restrictions. Hans moved closer, curious about materials that had become nearly unobtainable in Germany years earlier. "Christmas rush," explained a cheerful foreman, noticing the prisoner's interest. "We've got orders for fancy dress shoes. Party season coming up." He spoke through the translator with the casual confidence of someone for whom scarcity was an alien concept. "Don't worry, you boys will get holiday bonus pay for the overtime." The very idea of party shoes being produced during the fourth year of a global war was so bizarre that Hans struggled to process it. In Germany, civilians had been expected to sacrifice basic necessities for the war effort since the invasion of Poland. The notion that Americans were not only continuing to produce non-essential footwear, but ramping up production for holiday celebrations seemed impossible, obscene in its extravagance. Yet the evidence was before him. Specialized leather being cut for decorative women's evening shoes, children's patent leather dress styles, men's polished Oxfords, none with any military application. "Who wears such shoes in wartime?" Hans asked a middle-aged worker who operated a machine near his station. The man seemed confused by the question. "Regular folks, I guess. People still go to church, weddings, Christmas parties." He shrugged. "Life goes on, you know. My daughter's hoping for red pumps this year. She's 17. The casual response revealed something profound about American society that Hans had failed to grasp until that moment. The war, while taken seriously, hadn't fundamentally altered civilian life. Sacrifices were made, certainly. He'd seen the ration stamps and conservation posters, but they existed within a framework of such abundance that Americans could simultaneously fight a two-front global war while ensuring teenagers received fashionable shoes for Christmas dances. The disparity between this reality and conditions in Germany was so vast that Hans felt a wave of dizziness, as though the floor beneath him had suddenly tilted. During the lunch break, prisoners sat at designated tables in the factory cafeteria, separated from American workers, but receiving identical meals: hot beef stew, fresh bread, apple pie, and coffee with real sugar and cream. Hans ate mechanically, his mind still processing the morning's revelations. Across the room, he watched American workers laughing, complaining about normal concerns, discussing weekend plans, behaving as though the greatest conflict in human history was a distant inconvenience rather than an all-consuming reality. Some read newspapers that carried war news alongside advertisements for consumer goods that had disappeared from German shops years ago. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "They don't understand what war means," muttered Friedrich, the SS officer, pushing away his empty plate with undisguised bitterness. "They haven't suffered as Europe has suffered." Karl, who had remained largely silent throughout the meal, finally spoke. "Perhaps that is their strength, not their weakness." His voice was low, thoughtful. "They fight without dismantling their society. They produce without exhausting their resources. They feed the world, arm their allies, and still make dancing shoes for Christmas." He looked up, meeting Friedrich's gaze directly. "What if we were wrong about what makes a nation powerful?" The question hung between them, dangerous in its implications. No one responded immediately, but Hans noticed that even Friedrich, with his unwavering ideological commitment, offered no rebuttal. The afternoon whistle blew, calling them back to work, but the question followed them, more persistent than any guard. What if everything they had believed about strength and weakness, about national purpose and power, had been fundamentally flawed? What if shoes for everyone, the most mundane of objectives, revealed more about a nation's true capacity than all the martial speeches ever delivered in Berlin? The convoy of trucks arrived at Camp Devens 3 weeks before Christmas, their canvas-covered beds laden with wooden crates that piqued the curiosity of prisoners watching from barracks windows. Snow had fallen overnight, transforming the compound into a landscape that reminded many Germans of home, though here even the paths were quickly cleared by machines rather than shovels. Guards directed the trucks toward the supply buildings, where teams of workers began unloading their mysterious cargo under the watchful eyes of the camp quartermaster. "More food supplies, probably," said Werner, his breath fogging the window. "Americans always overstock for holidays." But Hans, who had developed a keen sense for shipment patterns during his factory work, shook his head. "Wrong type of packaging." "Those aren't provisions." They didn't have long to wonder. That evening at roll call, the camp commander made an announcement that left many prisoners struggling to maintain their disciplined formation. Each man would receive a package containing new winter boots, wool socks, a heavy coat, gloves, and a knit cap. Standard issue American Army surplus modified for prisoner use. The distribution would begin immediately after dinner. "New boots? For prisoners?" Karl whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. "In Germany, civilians wear wooden clogs because leather is reserved for soldiers." Hans remembered his father's workshop in the war's early years, how they'd resorted to using fish skin, pressed paper, even woven straw as leather substitutes. The army had requisitioned all quality materials, yet even Wehrmacht boots had grown increasingly inferior as the conflict progressed. By the time of his capture, Hans had been wearing boots resoled 3 times with composite material that disintegrated in wet conditions. The idea that America could spare leather footwear for enemy prisoners seemed impossible. That night in the distribution hall, Hans held his newly issued boots with the reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. The leather was thick yet supple, the stitching precise, the rubber soles deeply treaded for winter conditions. They were not elegant, clearly designed for practicality rather than aesthetics, but their quality exceeded anything available to German civilians since before the war. Even more shocking was the casual manner of their distribution. No special forms to complete, no lengthy justifications required, simply an efficient process of matching sizes to recipients, as though providing proper winter footwear to thousands of enemy prisoners was a routine matter rather than an extraordinary luxury. "Try them on," urged the American supply sergeant, noticing Hans's hesitation. "If they don't fit, we have other sizes." The concept of choice, of ensuring proper fit rather than simply distributing whatever was available, struck Hans as bizarre, almost decadent. In the Wehrmacht, ill-fitting boots were considered a normal hardship.
Men simply wrapped their feet in rags to prevent blisters. Yet here was an enemy nation insisting that even prisoners should have correctly sized footwear. As he unlaced his old boots, the ones he'd worn since training in Germany, now patched and cracked from campaigns across southern Europe, Hans felt a sudden reluctance that had nothing to do with practical concerns. These boots had marched with him through Italy. They carried the dust of Sicily and the mud of countless battlefields. Removing them felt somehow like shedding the last physical connection to his fighting days, to the cause he had served.
But the winter cold was real, and sentiment wouldn't warm frozen toes. With methodical care, he pulled on the American-made boots, surprised by their immediate comfort. "They fit well?" asked Karl, already wearing his new footwear. Hans nodded, unable to form words for a moment. The simple physical sensation of properly cushioned soles and protected ankles, comforts he'd forgotten existed, created an unexpected tightness in his throat. This small mercy, extended by people who had every reason to treat him harshly, contained a humanity that propaganda had never prepared him to encounter. Who were these Americans who fought ferociously on the battlefield, yet provided winter boots to the very men who had tried to kill them months earlier? What kind of nation produced such contradictions? Later that night, the barracks fell unusually silent as men contemplated their new winter gear.
Some, like Friedrich, had initially resisted accepting enemy charity, but pragmatism ultimately prevailed over pride. Others examined their boots with professional interest, noting construction details that revealed America's industrial advantages. A few simply wore them in silence, feet extended toward the heating stoves, experiencing the novel sensation of warmth in December. "In '42, said a voice from the shadows. Dieter Schmidt, a quiet infantryman who rarely spoke of his experiences. "We were outside Stalingrad. No winter boots had reached our division. Men wrapped newspaper and straw around their feet, but still the frostbite came." His voice remained flat, emotionless. Every morning, someone couldn't stand for roll call. Every evening, fewer boots by the fire. He looked down at his new American-issued footwear. "The captain told us to take boots from the dead," said a true German soldier could endure anything. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with similar memories none wished to articulate. They had all seen it: the gradual deterioration of German equipment, the broken promises of supply deliveries, the constant demands to accomplish more with less. Meanwhile, their American captors appeared to have inexhaustible resources, providing even enemy prisoners with quality winter boots as though the gesture required no special sacrifice or consideration. Hans lay awake long after lights out, listening to the soft sounds of sleeping men and occasional murmurs in German as someone dreamed of home. His new boots stood beside his bunk, their solid presence a silent rebuke to years of propaganda. The Nazi leadership had claimed that American materialism created weakness, that German spiritual strength and willingness to sacrifice would prevail against mere industrial might. Yet lying here in a heated barracks, stomach full, feet finally warm after years of winter misery, Hans confronted an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps material well-being wasn't opposed to national strength, but integral to it. Perhaps a country that could provide shoes for everyone, even its enemies, possessed a kind of power that transcended battlefield heroics and ideological fervor. The question that had been forming since his first day in the factory finally crystallized with perfect clarity. How could Germany have hoped to defeat a nation capable of such abundance that it treated enemy boots as a routine supply matter rather than an extraordinary luxury? The answer eluded him, but its implications cast long shadows across all the certainties he had once held dear. With spring came assignment to a new facility, a massive distribution center in Connecticut, where finished shoes from factories throughout New England were sorted, packaged, and shipped to destinations across America and overseas. Here, Hans witnessed the final stage of the production miracle that had so captivated him during winter. Endless rows of shelving rose to the ceiling, each section categorized by style, size, and destination. Conveyor systems carried boxed footwear from receiving areas to shipping docks, where trucks and rail cars waited to transport them across a continent. "27 million pairs moved through this facility last year alone," explained the supervisor during orientation, speaking with the casual pride Hans had come to recognize as distinctly American. That's just civilian shoes. Military procurement goes through separate channels. The number was so vast that Hans initially assumed he'd misunderstood the translation. 27 million pairs would provide new shoes for every man, woman, and child in a country the size of Austria. When he sought clarification, the supervisor simply shrugged. "Actually, that's down from our pre-war capacity. We've shifted about 30% of production to military footwear." For Hans, whose entire worldview had been shaped by scarcity economics, such figures seemed fantastical. Yet the evidence surrounded him in towering stacks of boxes bound for department stores, mail-order catalogs, and retail chains across America. What truly shocked him wasn't just the volume, but the variety. Work boots and dress shoes, children's sandals and women's heels, athletic footwear and bedroom slippers, hundreds of distinct styles in multiple colors and materials, each available in a complete range of sizes. This wasn't mere production. It was abundance elevated to an art form, a testament to a society that considered consumer choice a normal expectation rather than an unimaginable luxury. Working alongside American employees, Hans and the other prisoners began to grasp something fundamental about the nation that had defeated them. America's strength didn't derive simply from natural resources or manufacturing capacity, though both were impressive. Rather, it stemmed from a system that had transformed abundance into an organizing principle, that had democratized access to goods once considered luxuries, that had made enough for everyone not merely an economic objective, but a cultural expectation. Conversations among the prisoners shifted subtly as spring advanced. The initial shock of American prosperity gave way to more probing questions about its origins and meaning.
During lunch breaks, they debated what they were witnessing, sometimes joined by American workers curious about their perspectives. In Germany, Hans explained to a shipping manager who had asked about European shoe production, a quality pair of leather shoes would cost a worker 2 weeks' wages before the war. Most families owned perhaps 2 pairs, work shoes and Sunday best. Children often went barefoot in summer to save their shoes for school. The manager seemed genuinely surprised. But that's not because you couldn't make enough shoes, right? Germany had good manufacturing. It wasn't about production capacity, Hans agreed. It was about priorities. He struggled to find words for a concept so deeply ingrained he had never questioned it until now. Ordinary comforts weren't considered important. Sacrifice for national greatness was valued above individual well-being. "Sounds miserable," the manager said frankly, biting into his sandwich.
Hans might once have defended the austere German approach, perhaps citing spiritual strength forged through hardship. Now, surrounded by evidence of a system that delivered both national power and personal comfort, such arguments felt hollow. He thought of his mother darning the same stockings for years, of children in his neighborhood wearing shoes inherited from 3 siblings before them, of his father trying to make shoes from increasingly unsuitable materials as the war progressed, all justified as necessary sacrifices for the Reich's grand ambitions. Meanwhile, America fought the same war while producing party shoes for Christmas. "What will you do when you return home?" asked Verna one evening as they sat on the barracks steps watching the sunset. After seeing all this, Hans considered the question carefully. News from Germany grew increasingly grim. Allied bombing had devastated cities. Shortages of every kind plagued civilians.
The Reich that had promised thousand-year dominance now fought desperately for monthly survival. When repatriation eventually came, they would return to a homeland transformed by defeat. "I'll make shoes," Hans said finally. "Good ones, for ordinary people." Werner nodded, understanding the substance beneath the simple words. After witnessing American factories, none of them would view their crafts or trades the same way again. They had seen different possibilities, different priorities, different relationships between nation and citizen. Whatever Germany might become after Hitler, it would be shaped by men who had glimpsed alternative futures through the most mundane of lenses: shoes for everyone. In the final weeks before Germany's surrender, a peculiar incident occurred that crystallized everything Hans had learned during his captivity.
The distribution center received a special shipment, thousands of children's shoes designated for European relief efforts. These weren't military surplus or basic necessities, but proper leather shoes in a range of sizes, styles, and colors, manufactured to the same standards as American children's footwear. Hans watched as workers carefully packaged them with instruction leaflets printed in multiple languages, including German. "These are going to your country," said the floor manager, noticing Hans's interest. "To the occupied zones, for kids who've lost everything." The realization struck with unexpected force. America was preparing to send quality shoes to German children even while still fighting German soldiers. The war had not ended. Men were still dying on both sides. Yet here was evidence of planning not merely for victory, but for restoration. The enemy his leaders had described as vengeful and destructive was preparing comfort for the very population that had supported Hitler. What did it mean that a nation could think of children's shoes amidst the chaos of war's final spasms?
On May 8th, when news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached Camp Devens, the prisoners gathered in tense silence around the radio. Some wept openly. Others maintained rigid military bearing as though still standing on parade grounds in Berlin. Hans felt neither triumph nor despair, only a strange sense of inevitability, as though the outcome had been written in conveyor belts and leather cutters long before any military engagement. That evening, as the reality of defeat settled across the barracks, Karl approached Hans with an unusual request. "When you write to your family, tell them about the shoes." His voice was low, urgent. "Not just that America makes many, but that they're for everyone. Tell them what that means." Hans understood. They had witnessed more than industrial capacity. They had glimpsed an entirely different conception of what a society could prioritize, of how it might measure success.
The lesson wasn't about footwear, but about systems, about whether a nation existed to glorify itself through conquest and monuments, or to improve life for ordinary citizens through something as humble as well-made shoes. They had entered captivity convinced of German superiority in all things that mattered. They would return home carrying knowledge of a different kind of strength, one measured not in territorial gains or martial prowess, but in the ability to ensure that no child went barefoot, that no worker endured ill-fitting boots, that comfort was considered a reasonable expectation rather than an unnecessary luxury. Years later, Hans would establish a small but successful shoe factory in West Germany's rebuilding economy. Visitors often commented on his unusual business philosophy: reasonable prices, consistent quality, worker benefits that exceeded industry standards. When asked why he rejected the opportunity for greater profits, Hans would sometimes smile slightly and say, "I learned about shoes in America." Few understood the full meaning behind those simple words, how conveyor belts in Massachusetts had dismantled certainties more effectively than any bomb, how winter boots issued to prisoners had revealed more about national character than any propaganda, how the simple act of ensuring everyone had proper footwear contained an entire political philosophy. Perhaps somewhere in America, those factories still hum with production, still sending shoes to places where children need them, still embodying the quiet power that comes not from domination, but from abundance shared. Perhaps, if we listen carefully enough, we can hear in that mechanical rhythm the real story of how wars are won and lost, not just on battlefields, but on factory floors, where the humblest necessities reveal the deepest truths about what kind of world we choose to build.